Okay, part two of data modeling. Once we've identified the entities and we've identified the relationships between them, and we've made sure that the relationships that we've identified are real and aren't derivable from other relationships, we go in and we set what is called the cardinality of the relationship. And cardinality of the relationship simply means that we see how many of each are on each end in a typical relationship. Let me give you an example. Showed this diagram before, and I said that a supplier has a one-to-many relationship with product. And what you got to do is you got to go both ways in identifying this. One supplier can have many products, so one to many. You got to look at the flip side as well. A given product is only going to be supplied by one supplier, in this particular case anyhow. All right. In other words, Sprite is only supplied by the Coca-Cola company. Yet the Coca-Cola company can supply many different products. It can supply Coca-Cola, Sprite, so on, Diet Coke, so on and so forth. So that is a one-to-many relationship. There's really three kinds of relationships that you can have. And there's a one-to-many, which is a very typical relationship, probably the one that you see most often. There is a many-to-many relationship. In our diagram here, a many-to-many relationship might be between products and orders. In fact, it would be between products and orders. A given product can be on many orders. You know, a bunch of people might order cases of Diet Coke, for example, if this was a food distributor. A given order might also contain many products. In addition to cases of Sprite, it might also contain Diet Coke and Coca-Cola and so on and so forth. So therefore, there's a many-to-many relationship. A given product can be on many orders. A given order can contain many products. So that's a many-to-many relationship. All right. One thing about many-to-many relationships is they have to be resolved before they're put in a database. And the way you resolve a many-to-many relationship is what's called an intersecting entity. You would create something as an entity between the two. So for example, if I had order and products, I might create an entity called an order line item. And I would represent it like this. Whereas that represents the intersection of them. It says for a given order, these are the products that are involved. So for one order, there might be many line items. Each one of those line items is tied back to one product. All right? So the second thing that's done is we identify the relationships, including the cardinality of the relationships. So let's kind of complete this out. We have a one-to-many between customer and orders, right? Because one customer might have many orders, but a given order is only going to be for one customer. And finally, order to sales rep. One sales rep might have many orders. A given order is going to be only for one sales rep. So our finished ERD for this example would look like this. Now, there's one more kind of relationship that I didn't mention, and it didn't really show up in this one, and in reality it's kind of rare, and that is a one-to-one relationship. A one-to-one relationship might be something like the relationship between a football team and a head coach. All right? A given football team is only going to have one head coach. All right? You don't see tag team head coaches in the NFL. All right? A given coach, at least at one point in time, is only going to be the head coach of one team. So you have a one-to-one relationship. You might have, in businesses, you might have a one-to-one relationship between department and department manager. Each department only has one department manager, and each department manager only manages one department. So you have a one-to-one relationship between those. Again, one-to-ones are actually sort of rare. You really don't see those quite as often as you see the other kind. All right. What's the last step that you do in performing a data model? And that's where you identify the attributes. Attributes are characteristics of the entity. In other words, what are the pieces of data that we want to store for each supplier, for each order, for each customer, and so on and so forth. All right? For the supplier, I would imagine we would want to store the name of the supplier. We would want to store the phone number of the supplier. We would want to store the address of the supplier, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of basic attributes that you would store. There's one special kind of attribute, though, that's called the primary key. And the primary key is the field that's used to uniquely identify the member of the entity. For example, you here in college, you all have a student number, right? That is a primary key of the student table. There's no two students that have the same student number. If your student number is 1234, there's not another student that has 1234. That uniquely identifies you. All right? Every student has one, and no student has the same as another student. That's a characteristic of a primary key. Well, each of our tables or each of our entities should have a primary key. For a supplier, it might be something like supplier number. For customer, it might be customer number. For products, it might be the UPC code or the product number or something like that. Again, all these things are used, but they must uniquely identify members of that entity. That's one special attribute that needs to exist in every entity. All right. Another kind of attribute that exists is what's called a foreign key. And a foreign key is how we in the database establish that relationship. So for example, between products and suppliers, what we would have as one of the attributes in the product table, we would have the supplier ID number. So in the supplier table or the supplier entity, the primary key would be supplier ID, and you'd have the supplier name and other information. In the product table, the primary key would be product ID, and maybe the product description, and maybe the price, and so on down the line. But one of the attributes would be the supplier ID. That supplier ID is going to point back from the product to the supplier. So for example, if Coke was supplier 1234, then Sprite might be product 5723, but it would have in it an attribute of supplier ID that would point to Coke's supplier ID, 1234. And that's how we establish those relationships. All right. You only use the primary key of one table as an attribute in the other table to point back to it, all right, to establish a relationship. You would not, for example, put the name of Coca-Cola in Sprite. That's an attribute of the supplier. If you want to point a product to a supplier, you use the primary key of the supplier table, and that is the supplier ID. In a many-to-many relationship, such as this intersecting entity in the middle would actually have the primary key of both of the tables. So the order line item table would have contained within it the product ID and the order ID. All right. This is a very important concept and ought to be practiced a lot. And in this course, I'm sure we'll have a few examples. We'll probably have many examples, actually, of going in and practicing this database design. Really is a critical aspect of really getting a database correct. You have to spend the time to think through, talk to people in the organization, and understand how the data is organized. Again, to summarize the steps, first the entities are identified. Secondly, the relationships between those entities are identified, keeping two things in mind. You need to both identify the relationship and the cardinality of the relationship, that is, whether it's a one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. Other thing to keep in mind is some relationships you don't need to represent, in this example, between supplier and customer, because that can be derived through the other relationships. All right. The final thing that you need to identify is the attributes of those entities. That includes the pieces of data you want to capture about that entity, but it also includes those keys. The primary key is what identifies members of that entity, and the foreign keys is what point one entity to another entity, and that's what really in the database establishes a relationship. All right. As always, if you have any questions about this, please let me know. This is a very important concept. It's critical, one of the most important concepts relating to database.